There's a moment in warfare when the map stops reflecting reality, when the lines drawn by generals bear no resemblance to what is actually happening on the ground. And the only people who truly understand the situation are the ones standing in the cold, watching it collapse around them. In the winter of 1943, that moment arrived on the Eastern Front, and one commander made a choice that his superiors in Berlin called betrayal, but that history would quietly call correct. Here is what I want to ask you before we go any further. If you were the one standing in that city, watching your forces being surrounded, holding an order from the highest authority telling you to hold at all costs, would you obey? And more than that, do you think a single tactical decision made by a single commander in a single week can actually change the outcome of a war? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think, because by the end of this, your answer might surprise you. Now, let us go back. February 1943. The German 6th Army had just ceased to exist at Stalingrad. Not retreated, not regrouped, ceased to exist. 300,000 men had been swallowed by the encirclement, and the wound left in the southern German front was not a gap. It was an open fracture. Soviet forces were moving west with a momentum they had not felt since the early days of the German invasion. Two entire Soviet fronts were pushing deep into Ukrainian territory, racing toward the Dnieper River. If they reached it, they would sever the supply lines, feeding every German unit in the south. The war in that region would not shift. It would simply end. Into this disintegrating landscape, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was handed what remained. And what remained, in terms of actual offensive capability, was thin. Almost everything on that front had been ground down by months of brutal fighting, frozen supply lines, and the sheer weight of a winter that treated machines and men with equal indifference. Almost everything, but not quite everything. There was one formation that still had teeth. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps had been built for exactly this kind of moment. Not for comfortable advances on favorable terrain, not for garrison duty, not for plugging gaps in a quiet sector. It had been equipped, reorganized, and transported to the Eastern Front as a strike instrument, a force that could be inserted into a crisis and used to alter the outcome. 3 divisions composed it, each carrying its own identity and its own history, but all sharing a structural logic that made them collectively something the standard German infantry divisions of that period simply were not. The Leibstandard, the Das Reich, and the Totenkopf. 3 names that carry enormous weight in the history of that war, and not all of it comfortable. But on a purely technical and operational level, what these formations represented in early 1943 was a concentration of combined arms capability was genuinely rare in any army on any front. Each division contained mechanized infantry mounted on half-tracks, medium tank regiments equipped with the upgraded Panzer IV, self-propelled artillery, assault engineer units, and motorized reconnaissance elements. Together, they formed a system designed to move, strike, and sustain momentum across terrain that would stop conventional formations cold. But there was one additional element that changed the equation in a more fundamental way. The heavy tank battalions equipped with the Tiger Eye. This is the moment to pause and explain what that actually meant in practice, because the Tiger's reputation has been both inflated by legend and reduced by retrospective critique, until the real significance of its presence in that campaign has become somewhat blurry. The Tiger Eye was not an invincible weapon. It was slow, mechanically demanding, and its consumption of fuel imposed strict limits on how far it could advance before requiring resupply. In the mud and frost of the Ukrainian winter, its weight created constant problems with certain types of ground, and starting its engine in extreme cold required specific procedures that cost time. None of that changes the fundamental tactical reality created on the battlefield. At medium and long range, Tiger's main gun could defeat the Soviet T-34 at distances where the T-34 could not reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. That single asymmetry, maintained consistently across engagements, meant that when Tiger-equipped units met Soviet armor in open terrain, the exchange ratio was structurally favorable to the Germans in a way that had not been true with medium tanks alone. The Soviets had achieved a degree of armored parity with the T, 34 by 1942. The Tiger temporarily broke that parity, and in the winter of 1943, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps still had its Tiger battalions near their maximum operational strength. But here's something that is often overlooked when analysts discuss this campaign. The Tigers mattered, but they were not the decisive variable. The decisive variable was something far less dramatic. It was communication. The divisions of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps operated a radio network that allowed real-time coordination between combined arms elements at battalion and company level. Infantry commanders could communicate with tank commanders. Artillery units could receive targeting information and adjust in minutes rather than hours. Reconnaissance elements moving ahead of the main columns could relay terrain and resistance data back before the main force committed to a route or axis of advance. This might sound like a basic capability. In 1943, on the Eastern Front, it was not basic, it was exceptional. The Soviet forces opposing them at that stage of the war still relied heavily on telephone lines and physical messengers for tactical communication. Orders moved through layers of command before reaching the units that needed to act on them. By the time a Soviet battalion commander received confirmation to adjust his position in response to a German maneuver, the German units executing that maneuver had already moved past the point the order was designed to address. The Germans called their underlying doctrinal principle Auftragstactik, mission tactics. The concept was straightforward, but its implications were profound. A commander, battalion, or company level was given an objective and the authority to determine how to achieve it based on conditions in front of him. He did not need to stop, draft a request, send it up the chain of command, wait for approval, and then act. He assessed, decided, and acted. Then he communicated what he had done. This produced a decision cycle that consistently ran faster than anything a more centralized command structure could match. Now here is the question I want to sit with for a moment, and I genuinely want you to think about this. Is it the weapons that win battles, or is it the speed at which decisions are made? Because what we are about to see suggests the answer is more complicated than most people assume. By the middle of February 1943, the city of Kharkov was being enveloped. Soviet forces were pushing around the northern approaches, threatening to close the ring. The commander of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, Paul Hauser, was holding an explicit order from Adolf Hitler. Kharkov was to be held as a fortified city. No withdrawal, no tactical reorientation. Hold, Hitler's conception of cities as symbols had hardened into strategic doctrine by this point in the war. A city that was surrendered was a symbol lost. A symbol lost was a political defeat. The logic was not military. It was psychological, rooted in a belief that the act of holding determined the perception of strength. Hauser saw something different. He saw supply lines being severed progressively. He saw the ground beginning to soften as the first hints of the thaw arrived, making secondary routes increasingly difficult for motorized vehicles. He saw the arithmetic of encirclement moving toward its conclusion, and he calculated that the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, destroyed in a siege, was worth nothing to anyone, but the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, intact and mobile south of the city, was still a force capable of changing the strategic situation. On approximately the 15th of February, he ordered the withdrawal. The fury from Berlin was immediate. But Hauser had already moved his forces out, and the argument was rendered academic by events, because what followed the withdrawal demonstrated, with uncomfortable clarity, that he had been right. The reorganization that occurred south and southwest of Kharkov in the days after the withdrawal was itself operationally significant. The divisions absorbed their losses, redistributed fuel and ammunition, repaired and recovered what could be saved, and reconstituted their combat elements into new tactical groupings. This was done quickly, not perfectly, but quickly enough. And then Manstein's design began to unfold. The field marshal had been watching the Soviet advance with the particular attention of someone who recognizes when an opponent has outrun his own strength. The Soviet spearheads racing toward the Dnieper were extended. Their supply lines stretched further with each passing day. Their forward units were operating with decreasing fuel and ammunition reserves, sustained by a logistics chain that had been designed for a pursuit, not for sustained defensive operations against organized resistance. Manstein's plan did not attempt to stop the Soviet advance along the entire front. That would have dispersed his available forces into a defensive line too thin to hold anywhere. Instead, the plan allowed the advance to continue while preparing to strike the flanks of the penetration once the Soviet forces had committed fully to their westward push. The objective was not to slow them. The objective was to let them extend, then cut them off. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps was the instrument for the northern arc of this maneuver. The Leibstandard and Das Reich divisions moved as the primary strike elements, advancing northeast to get behind the Soviet columns that had pushed toward Pavlograd. The movement was not textbook clean. The terrain alternated between patches of frozen ground firm enough to bear the weight of vehicles and sectors where the subsurface remained soft beneath a deceptive frozen crust. Tank commanders and reconnaissance units continuously adjusted routes, passing information back through the radio network, allowing the main columns to avoid sectors that would have cost hours of recovery operations for bogged vehicles. The Totenkopf, meanwhile, took a different function. While the other 2 divisions drove into the flank of the Soviet advance, the Totenkopf covered the western flank of the Corps itself, protecting the supply corridor and preventing the kind of counter-envelopment that a more passive approach to flank security might have invited. The destruction of the Soviet forces caught in this maneuver was not a clean surgical operation. It was a grinding, accelerating collapse. Units that had advanced confidently weeks earlier found their supply lines gone, their communications disrupted, and German armor appearing from directions that did not correspond to where the front had been. The Soviet Guards formations that bore the brunt of this phase of the operation were reduced from coherent fighting forces to fragmented groups attempting to withdraw northward across terrain that was working against them as actively as the enemy. For the first time since Stalingrad, the strategic balance in southern Ukraine had shifted, but the operation was not finished. Kharkov, now sitting with its Soviet garrison exposed and vulnerable, was the next objective, and taking it would require the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to execute something fundamentally different from the open-terrain maneuver warfare at which it had just demonstrated its expertise. Urban combat is a different discipline entirely. The geometry of streets, buildings, and enclosed spaces neutralizes many of the advantages that favor an attacker in open terrain. Range becomes irrelevant when the maximum sight line is the width of a city block. The protective value of thick armor diminishes when the threat arrives from close range, from elevation, from directions that a tank's turret may not cover quickly enough, and the logistics of clearing a city building by building, floor by floor, consumes ammunition and human energy at rates that open-terrain operations rarely approach. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps organized its response to these constraints through assault groups built at company and battalion level. Each group paired mechanized infantry as the primary movement element, with tanks in a direct support role. The tanks were not leading. They were enabling. Their function was to suppress identified defensive positions so that the infantry could move, rather than to advance and engage independently. Engineer teams with demolition charges and flamethrowers provided the capability to neutralize heavily fortified positions. Neither infantry nor tank could approach frontally without prohibitive cost. Self-propelled artillery fired directly against buildings being used as strongpoints, eliminating the structures themselves when position-by-position clearance would have taken too long. The 3 divisions converged on the city from different directions simultaneously. The Leibstandard from the south, Das Reich from the west. The Totenkopf, having completed its flank coverage role, moved to close the northern approaches and block reinforcement and supply routes into the city. The multidirectional pressure meant that any local counterattack the defenders mounted in one sector created opportunity in another. Every time Soviet reserves concentrated to halt an advance on one axis, the radio network relaying that information allowed the other elements to accelerate their penetration where resistance had thinned. By the 15th of March 1943, Kharkov was back in German hands. The full sequence had taken approximately 4 weeks. Withdrawal, reorganization, open-terrain counterattack, and urban assault. 4 qualitatively different operations, chained together under logistical pressure, in conditions that were transitioning from deep winter toward the unpredictable mud season, with all the mechanical strain that transition imposed on equipment that was already being pushed to its limits. There's a temptation, when looking at this campaign, to frame it as a demonstration of German military superiority in a broader sense. That framing is both incomplete and misleading. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps succeeded in February and March of 1943 under a specific set of conditions that would not repeat themselves. Its Tiger battalions were at near maximum strength. Its mechanized infantry retained a high proportion of its half-tracks in operational condition. Its fuel and ammunition reserves, though tight, were sufficient to sustain continuous offensive action. Most critically, the Soviet forces it faced had extended their supply lines past the point of reliable sustainment, which transformed their apparent strength into a structural vulnerability that Manstein's design could exploit. From Kursk onward, each of these conditions would begin to erode. The attrition of material that could not be fully replaced, the loss of experienced personnel, no training program could quickly regenerate, the progressive shortening of available fuel and ammunition as the German strategic position contracted, the improving logistical competence of the Soviet military, which would make the kind of extended penetration that created the opening in 1943 increasingly difficult to achieve. What Kharkov demonstrated was not that this formation was invincible. It demonstrated something more precise and more instructive, that the combination of integrated combined arms capability, decentralized command authority, and real-time communication could produce outcomes that raw numerical comparison would not predict, but only in the window of time and the specific set of conditions where those advantages could fully express themselves. The moment passed, the conditions changed, and the same formation that had executed the most complete operational sequence of its history in those 4 weeks would spend the remaining years of the war in a grinding defensive struggle it was never designed to win. Which brings us back to where we started. The map that stopped reflecting reality. The commander who looked at an order and chose the survival of his force over obedience to a symbol. The decision that looked, in the moment, like insubordination, but that created the precondition for everything that followed. There are situations in history where one choice, made at the right moment by someone with the right information and the clarity to act on it, creates a window that would not otherwise have existed. Hauser's decision to leave Kharkov was not the cause of what came next. But without it, what came next could not have happened. That is not a comfortable thought for those who prefer their historical lessons to be clean, but is an honest one. And I think that tension between what an order says and what a situation actually requires is something that extends well beyond the history of that particular winter on that particular front. Think about the last time you were given instructions that you knew, based on your direct experience of the situation, were wrong. What did you do? Leave that in the comments. I read them, and that conversation is always worth having. The Kharkov campaign of 1943 stands as a compressed, almost clinical demonstration of what the doctrine of mobile warfare could achieve when the unit was properly equipped, properly led, and facing an enemy that had temporarily overextended itself. It is, in that precise sense, the high point of that kind of warfare on the Eastern Front. And high points, by definition, are followed by something else. What came after was longer, harder, and ultimately decisive in a different direction entirely. But that is another story. Some of you are already subscribed. Thank you, genuinely. If you are not yet, this is your sign. Join us. There is much more coming.